Chapter 10, Development of Behavior and Learning. As we develop, thoughts and feelings develop in tandem. We have mentioned how they both affect and are, in turn, affected by behavior and mood. As we have seen, how we react to or behave in our environment is determined by experience, how we think and how we feel. How we think and how we feel changes as we gain more experience. In other words, the thought will eventually affect the thinking and the feeling will affect the way we feel the next time. We explained the mechanism. Now, we're going to go one step further and explain behavior. Until now, our explanations have been egocentric. That is a fancy way of saying, it's all about me. As we develop, we are into ourselves and to fully understand, develop and feel, we differentiate ourselves from what is going on around us. But, the driving forces of how we feel and how we think are generated from within. The locus, the frame of reference is ourselves. Behavior is completely different. We become more and more orientated to what the outside world is doing as we get older. By the age of about 10, we are more influenced, behavior-wise, by the outside world than by ourselves. It's hard to differentiate behavior from thoughts and feelings in the early stages. Nevertheless, this is a good point to recap. In the beginning, we feel and we cannot differentiate between ourselves and what is going on around us. Eventually, we are able to think and realize, defining ourselves from the outside world and understanding how dependent we are on the outside world. As we do so, we develop a gamut of emotions and explanations which are tested. Eventually, a lot of these thoughts and feelings are part on the level of automatic everything. As this process develops, we are developing the ability to store our experiences and to draw from them as part of the automatic everything process. As you remember, we ended the last chapter by mentioning how we begin to invest our thoughts into explanations, and we invest values into sets of explanations which then become beliefs. Beliefs are ours at first, but watch what happens as time goes by. We also explained fantasies and daydreams. As curiosity drives us away from the caring parent, anxiety and fear bring us back. As I mentioned before and I want to restate, this anxiety can be of two kinds: I do not know how my mother will relate, or I do not know what I will find. These are two sets of anxieties and, in my opinion, they form different kinds of pathologies. The paradigm expresses well the different kinds of illnesses or defects that may occur. As a foretaste, I will mention that anxiety, which is inherited from mother, seems to be less pathological than the anxiety inherited by our own innate feeling that the sky is falling. In the beginning, we are accepting and developing our behavior as part of our mother and father. We learn to cope within the norms and laws of the family. This becomes particularly interesting when a child learns to cope within a very disturbed family. His coping skills are very well developed for this situation. However, the coping skills the child has developed will serve him badly when the child is in a normal situation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your luck, we obtain much of the coping skills, if not all of them, when coping in the family situation, and they go straight into the automatic everything. In other words, they go unchecked until we discover the automatic skill is inappropriate. I hope you can begin to see the relevance of nurture and nature. What is more important, your genes or your upbringing? The answer you would think is both. That is the same with all of medicine. Genes give the tendency and you do the rest. Nevertheless, this is not ironclad. My kids got a double whammy. According to everything about nurture and nature, my kids should all be in closed wards. They are boringly normal. Before any wry comments, they all have two of my very distinctive birthmarks. Either my wife's gene pool dried my swamp out or not everything is ironclad. Seriously, take everything with a pinch of salt. Back to our narrative about the developing child. Eventually, the child will leave home and enter the education system. Generally, this is the age of 3 or 4. I want to make another detour. In medicine, the vast majority of illnesses that are not infectious have prodromal phases which can be up to 10 years long. Cancer caught at a very early stage invariably is eminently curable. Many cancers have precancerous states, such as polyps. We have a pretty good idea as physicians, who in 10 years' time will have a myocardial infarction. Similarly, we can predict who is liable to have cancer of the lungs. It is the same with behavior. 8% of children are at risk. These children will go on to develop personality disorders or mental illnesses. Invariably, when we go back and ask the staff of the kindergarten, and by this, I mean all the staff, we will find that they have noticed something. I will return to this fully when I'm discussing therapy and services. Back to the developing child. At this stage, the child is learning to socialize. The child is learning the importance of values and group pressure, the feeling of what is right and what is wrong, which at first can be quite rigid and illogical. This phase is the beginning of the concept of group value and group or social pressures. Here, we not only see the lone child being bullied, but group acceptance. Even at this early age, ideas of sexuality and differences are becoming evident. Kids tend to go and bond with things they know and recognize. They tend to exclude those from the outside and become quite cliquish. At the same time, they learn to give explanations, rationalizations, of why they are doing so. The explanations are often both flexible and can be questioned. The implications for social intervention and politics are evident. As this book is not a book on sociology, I will not delve further into this topic apart from stating that, in my opinion, the tendency goes unremarked into adulthood and we find it exploited in politics, ask Cambridge Politica. If I were to explain it in my model, I would say that the grouping and bonding had a biological benefit, and as it is primarily a defensive mechanism, the emotive component of bonding is uppermost. As with many emotions, it goes unquestioned. As an emotion, it is transmitted rapidly. As I said before, politics is about emotion that spreads fast. Intellectualizing is slow and easily becomes diluted, like in the Chinese whispers. With the approach of sexuality, there are more constraints placed upon us, many of which are biologically significant and advantageous, but nevertheless, they are reinforced initially by social anxiety which slips into a belief system, and in itself, becomes an unchallenged fact. Changes in beliefs or acceptance of the behavior are almost as revolutionary as changes in religion or any other rigid social framework. Changes are often tectonic and not evolutionary. Our social mores are changed by revolution and not by evolution. We are witnessing this in the revolutionary change to the attitude to women. As in all revolutions, the winners take no prisoners and old transgressors can be quite viciously dealt with. In many respects, we are behaving in the only way we know when we need to change unwanted social behavior. I am not criticizing the changes. To be quite blunt, I detest those who vaunted the values of hunting women. I understand that the change will involve people feeling themselves as the nouveau victims. I see why many detest the process of change as being hysterical. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it certainly is the only way we know how to make social changes. Social mores are part of our automatic behavior. We do not question them. Many factors can and will affect our sexuality. I've already mentioned one. As a child who grew up in the 60s, I know how the advent of AIDS changed our sexual behavior. It was only after the fear of dying that we started to consider the morality of our rampant imperialistic sexuality. With AIDS, there was no need for a crusade. To change women's rights, there was a need for a revolution. From the small group mentality which we learn in kindergarten, as we grow older and go out into the world, we see a big frightening place. From small groups, we find ourselves identified with large groups. We need this identity because if not, we're exposed and threatened. Again, because it is a defensive mechanism, the emotive factors predominate the cognitive ones. As an example, we know when we feel good, and well, we feel good. We know when we feel bad and where we don't belong. But, this is a feeling and it is not something we can define. Whenever we do try to define it, we find ourselves tongue-tied. As I have stated often, I am fascinated by politics and in particular, local politics. One of the things that amuses me with many candidates is the propensity to talk about the quality of life. Everyone knows what it is, and yet, no one has a clue what it is. As a proponent of politics, I would suggest that it is identity with, involvement in and pride of whatever is going on around you. Another definition is the ability to do and enjoy what you should be doing at the age you are. As you will see later, in fact very shortly, there are stages in life where we are and should be doing certain things. What you will notice with both definitions is that the emotion and the emotive component of the definition are preeminent. This is what we are trying to do, and this is our behavior. Much, if not all of our behavior is primarily based on emotion when we are in a situation that involves more than the immediate family or a one-on-one relationship. Then we are behaving in group or herd mentalities. As I've stated above, we are mainly emotionally driven in voting for our leader. We choose by first having an emotional reason for doing so. It is only later that we give a cognitive certificate of approval to our gut feelings. Sometimes we find it difficult to even accept our own explanations, or we feel a wee bit embarrassed. I am certain that this is why people who have certain voting intentions will hide them from themselves and pre-poll pollsters. Emotions rule when they get into the election booth. I am convinced this is a reason why so often, the opinion polls are wrong. The opinion polls are asking people what they are thinking. People vote according to their feelings. They are not the same. A lot of people claim that people lied to the polling agencies when both Clinton and Perez lost their elections. They didn't lie to the pollsters. The joke says they lied in the voting booth. It's a good joke, but it misses an important point. In herds, we are visceral. Alone, we are thinking more analytical. I am now going to mention in passing, learning. As I stated before, I wish to go into this fully when talking about therapies and treatment. Suffice it to say that we go from the stages of understanding to knowing by rote. I mention this now because when I later mention neurosis, you will see this becoming important. We know at school, 1 + 1 = 2, which is something we understand by repeating it, and it becomes part of something we know. It is not something we need to draw from our deep memory banks that we use when recalling experiences. Singular facts which are not involved with emotion, not deeply involved anyway, can be stored in the automatic everything, in the cognitive side. What we know can be acquired, in other words, used and then become a full part of our everyday toolbox. I wouldn't be too concerned about trying to understand exactly what I'm saying. I think it is important that you understand there are a few stages to change F, and we can use the learning paradigm. We will go over this much more fully when we are talking about therapy and how to change behavior. Then it becomes important. But, there is a caveat. Relapses do occur under social pressure. The drug addict will only fully quit if removed from the reinforcing milieus he calls home. A similar example is the dieter being offered a small bite, it won't kill you. You can see how AA and dieting groups are effective. They accept the possibility of relapse and work with it. We are now going to take a closer look at something which is blatantly obvious and yet, is often overlooked. By the time we have matured, we know ourselves in 3 particular modes. We know ourselves as parents, adults, and children. When we are in a relationship, we tend to relate to the other member in the relationship as if he is a parent, adult or child, and we tend to behave as a parent, adult or child. The parent is caring and planning for the child. Any combination is possible, and if you sit back, you can probably picture different relationships where you have taken different roles or the person opposite you is in different roles too. Very often, we find that our role-playing is interchangeable. Sometimes we behave as an adult, sometimes as a parent and sometimes as the child. In certain situations, we tend to find ourselves pressed into playing roles which we, in retrospect, realize we shouldn't be playing. Certain environments encourage certain role plays. Certain cultures encourage certain role-playing and preconceived ideas or beliefs, with a small b, to define the role of the parent, adult and child. Very often, we are talking about male and female equivalents in preconceived ideas of the parent, adult and child. All this becomes very relevant when we later discuss the significance of parent, adult and child, PAC, in therapy. David was an ex-RAF pilot. Like all soldiers, he would know that acronyms are a good way of making something simple, complicated. As a corollary of PAC, we see another set of relationships which can be overlooked and highly problematic. In a lot of transactions, we have to ask, who is ultimately responsible? Who is in control to do whatever is to be done and who takes the blame when it goes wrong? Often, especially in stressful situations, you will find that the roles are not clear. Let's make an example. The parent is responsible for the child's upbringing, the child behaves badly. Then, who is to blame? How often do we see the parent, not only responsible, but also trying to control the child's behavior, not letting the child function and apportioning blame before anything goes wrong? We see it at work. The boss refuses responsibility, but wants absolute control, and we know who will be at fault. There is a simple rule: you must decide who is control of the entire situation and who is responsible to do whatever is to be done. They may be one and the same. But the golden rule is you cannot accept blame for something you are neither responsible for its execution or its overseeing. In other words, roles have to be clear. There has to be a decision and there has to be an execution. Blame is apportioned, when necessary, in whoever failed in his role. To finalize the chapter, I will tell you two more important things. Behavior is learned. We acquire it from the surroundings, and by having it accepted and being accepted, we engineer ourselves into the safest situation. So often, our behavior is affected by feelings. One of the definitions I use for the quality of life is the ability to enjoy doing what you should be doing at the time of life that you are at. Let's look briefly at times of life. It sounds trite, but in the first 10 years we are learning to be a child. In the second 10 years, we are learning to be adults, and in the third 10 years, we are learning to be parents and competing in the job market. In the fifth and sixth 10 years, we are beginning to unwind and realize that what we had to do, we are doing. We begin wondering what awaits afterward in the later years. Or should I say, I am at the point where I am giving support and knowledge to those who are going through the cycles I have already gone through. Now, I have taken a step back and I was waiting for David to arrive on the scene. It is so sad he was taken from us. Maybe it sounds melodramatic, but when I was younger, I was looking up the hill and I was fearful of the crevices, ravines and soaring streams I had to cross. Later, as I looked down from the summit, I saw and enjoyed what I had traversed and dearly wanted to help others enjoy their crossing, not only enjoy having crossed. Defense mechanisms. The other important thing is defense mechanisms. It is hard to explain the relevance of defense mechanisms. The idea was employed by Freud, who saw the ego and thus, the individual as being under constant threat. I don't know why he had to use the form of defense mechanisms, but it comes to explain how the individual develops. Defense mechanisms can also explain personality. I don't see us being under permanent threat. We do have to survive, and survival can be tricky. I think that instead of referring to it or thinking of it as defense, it would be more appropriate to think of it as gaining new adaptation skills, then realizing that these skills can become either overused, underused or absolutely missing. This will determine the character of the personality. As we have seen, the personality develops and so does the behavior. I suppose I could be very abstract and suggest that we are behaving very much like a mathematical function. The function is described by the action and properties. In the use of the so-called defense mechanisms, we see actions which eventually become properties. In other words, an act becomes a style of behaving. Let me put that simpler. If I repeatedly always choose vanilla ice cream, then it becomes part of me, and whenever I go to the ice cream parlor, my choice will be recognized as part of me by the seller. The salesperson has no need to ask what I want, but simply asks something like, the usual? In the beginning, the baby is separating and individuating. The defense mechanism is called splitting. The baby is deciding between good and bad, between black and white, between self and other. This very simplistic primary defense mechanism is in actual fact the first act of defining self. When it comes into play, we often see it as the last line between self and non-self. In our terms, it is the breakdown of boundaries and usually comes to represent the breakdown of boundaries between the conscious and unconscious world we are living in, namely ourselves. Having split between ourselves and others, we then find methods of ascertaining what belongs to us and what belongs to others. When we ascribe things to ourselves, we tend to use a defense mechanism called introjection. This defense mechanism, when becoming faulty, will explain both forms of narcissism and depression. Far more commonly, we use a defense mechanism called projection. Generally, we push for things that are bad upon the object we are projecting upon. Remember the temper tantrums we had as children? How evil our mothers sometimes seem to be. As the child is discovering its new world, it experiences some stuff it cannot handle. There are a few defense mechanisms that come into play. If the material is so deeply scaring, it is repressed and not only closed off in our subconscious, but the subconscious is seemingly walled off. No matter how good the walling off is, it will eventually, and almost inevitably, lead to a loss of energy and ability to do other things. The anxiety and fear associated with the event will seep into our very being. We are talking about the trauma of childhood, very often sexual exploitation by an adult. When the child discovering its world encounters something which evokes anxiety, yet, he does not quite know how to cope with the anxiety, he tries different coping strategies. One would expect this to lead to the survival of the fittest strategy. But, for some reason which I cannot explain, the doing of looking for a new and better alternative seems to get stuck, and the child goes on repeating the same behavior as if it is bringing relief, and it is not. Instead of abandoning the behavior, the child repeats it as if this time it might bring relief. We call this behavior repetitive and is obsessive in nature. Again, I find it very hard to explain why it should happen and what role it is fulfilling. As the child enters the age of sexuality, there are a new set of anxiety-provoking stimuli, and one of the ways of dealing with this is by idealization of a person or sublimation of an action. As I've stated, I think you should be aware that there are such things as a defense mechanism. When they are trotted out, you should be aware of what they are and should be aware that there are some more. I feel that the relevance of these defense mechanisms is minor and probably only of importance in personality disturbances. Why is this important? Because in therapy, sometimes we cannot deal with the problem of the patient by merely dealing with the dynamics involved in automatic everything. Automatic everything deals with the aware/non-aware part of the conscious. Sometimes, we need to attempt to delve into the realms of the subconscious. When this happens, we have to use a very different kind of therapy.